Welcome to our inaugural episode of our new podcast, Trust the Science, podcasts where we aim to discuss contemporary and historical examples of how technology and advancement in the scientific realm have resulted in potentially negative outcomes towards people, society, and even the environment. I'd like to start by introducing myself and my esteemed co-host. My name is Dr. D, and I'm joined here by my good friend and colleague, Dr. B.
Dr. B.
To talk a little bit about ourselves. Together we have spent, a fair amount of time in academia, over a decade, I think, between the two of us.
Correct.
And both of us have recently graduated from a very prestigious university with our Ph.Ds. Mine being in chemistry and biochemistry.
And mine being chemistry, focus on medicinal chemistry.
So you could say that we're scientists to some degree. As I mentioned, we've dabbled in academia. We've published a number of articles within academic journals, and actually now we both work at the same company in a private sector, still continuing that pursuit of science. So yeah, we know a little bit, I'd say. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that it's also, we're new enough to not blindly trust the institutions and everything that we're told. Still like to question a little bit, still don't know everything enough, so we come up with some other non-orthodox ways of thinking.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Is going through, I think, our academic experience, we often sometimes encountered situations where we might not necessarily agree with the mainstream perspectives of how things were being portrayed, but we'll get into that in greater detail, very specific topics later. As I mentioned, the focus here is to kind of talk about where science, obviously has been greatly impactful and beneficial for society at large, but there are a number of instances I think we're all aware of, especially more recently, where it has maybe not failed us, but resulted in some unforeseen consequences. There are a couple that come to my mind pretty quickly, but are there any that really come to your mind off the top of your head that you're kind of passionate about talking about?
Yeah, I think it's just always important to realize that nothing is perfect and there's side effects to everything. And sometimes the good outweighs the bad. And then society cares more about society than the individual, but as individuals it's important to think what's best for you, what's best for your family, what's best for your community. Yeah,
I think ultimately it's about bringing up the idea that we have to be aware of what science is in the modern sense, and how people have I guess perpetuate certain ideas in the name of science that may be a little misleading.
Yeah.
And right now, I think more than ever in our human history, we have more access to information than we've ever had. But it's not all necessarily good information or correct information. There's a lot of red herrings, there's a lot of biases out there, there's a lot of avenues that can be pretty complex and confusing, even to someone like myself or like you, who has a pretty extensive background dealing with objective and scientific papers and things like that. I think that one of the big ideas here is that we like to discuss these topics not just from the background of our scientific understanding, because a lot of what we're going to talk about moving forward isn't necessarily within our realm of specialty, but just kind of in a layman's overview, and then to get into a detailed discussion over the different perspectives, ultimately trying to provide both sides of different relative controversial debates or topics, because I think it's important to do that and not just stay narrow-mindedly focused on one of those stories.
Try to give a balanced perspective, at least two sides of the stories, if not three or four.
Yeah. In some cases, there's definitely multiple layers of complexity, I think, that will come out. Yeah, so without being too long-winded, there's another topic I just wanted to bring up too, that I think, like I said, distrust in science is at kind of all-time high. One of the reasons I think for that being relatively recent events in the 2000s and later, but even in the last couple of years, I would be kind of out of place to not at least address that, yeah, we have chosen the name of this podcast to be Trust the Science pretty deliberately, I'd say, because it is kind of the mantra that has become popularized in the mainstream culture and society in the last couple of years, especially with the onset of things like the COVID pandemic. Obviously, that's a pretty controversial kind of topic, polarizing topic, but I think that's also why it's relevant.
Right.
And trust the science, I remember specifically sitting there watching people on TV, quote unquote scientists, tell us, trust the science, follow the science. When they're referencing various things related to COVID, whether it was, masks, and later, of course, vaccines.
Just going outside.
Yeah, there was a whole bunch of, I think, controversial topics where people were basically like, trust in the scientists. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad idea all the time. I mean, we are scientists. I'd like to think that we're not bad people with evil intent. I think we're pretty well educated and, have done some very productive things. But this idea of just trusting in the institution of science, I think, without ever questioning motive or potential bias is kind of a dangerous notion. I mean, it's actually kind of a contradiction into itself. Those words are kind of cringy when you break down the definition of science, which is kind of the objective and observational process of trying to determine why a phenomenon happens, and trust, which is kind of the opposite of that.
It's important to also know that the science isn't a static thing. It's dynamic. It changes
Absolutely.
From day to day, from each data point that comes in. And maybe it should be, instead of trust the science, trust but verify the science.
Yeah. Trust in the process, I guess.
Yeah.
I think that's a really great point, because oftentimes, as we'll see and talk about, science is not linear in terms of success. Oftentimes, there is an experiment, and the first experiment usually doesn't work. I know you've experienced that. I've definitely experienced that. I mean, there are things where, obviously complex problems take not just days, weeks, or years, but sometimes decades, and oftentimes there's a lot of failure, and unfortunately in that process, well, people can, face the negative repercussions of that. But does that necessarily make it a bad thing? No, not necessarily. But it is important to be aware that science is kind of this imperfect, nonlinear pathway. But anyhow, I think I'm excited to talk about some very, I think, relevant topics, and I think we've already alluded to some of them. But one of the first, I think, general topics that we're going to discuss is the idea of different vaccines that have been employed over the last century or so, with the intent of helping humankind overcome some pretty devastating diseases. And of course, I think the general consensus is that this wasn't done really with malintent, but there are a number of examples where, unfortunately, there have been some negative repercussions. I don't know if you'd like to talk about how you've maybe dabbled with a couple of these topics, or are you interested? Is this a topic that interests you, or is this kind of a new thing?
I think that anything that directly affects your life would be something of extreme interest, and I think that this directly affected everybody's life. Maybe one of the first few things, at least in my lifetime, that directly affected me, my parents, people younger than me. So really going into it, from my point of view, I had to consider my health, my age, and the likelihood of, given the data at the time, what would be my best course of action. Because if I just stayed in my house the entire time, it's kind of hard to have a life. And during this time, we were both in grad school, and so if you don't do experiments in grad school, you don't graduate. And it's quite common that some students at least take any excuse not to work and end up staying for over 8 years. And so it's not uncommon that you don't graduate for a very long time. And to me, earning below poverty wages wasn't something that I could necessarily live with.
Right. No one wants to do that. Yeah, so I mean, you're talking about obviously the challenge of navigating COVID pandemic, this potential kind of almost too good to be true vaccine that's supposed to mitigate our risk of getting sick or passing that along to loved ones, and also the potential risks, really the unknowns. And I mean, I don't know about you, I didn't necessarily read every word of the thing that we signed when you get that, but I read some of it, and it definitely was kind of concerning. I mean, we're both scientists, we're aware that, like, okay, as a part of an experiment, essentially, a very large one, things could go awry, not to plan.
Just need to know that whoever gave it to you was not liable for any side effects.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I read, and that's kind of what gives me pause.
It's kind of, it's something that's going to make you kind of go, well, why are they doing that? Obviously, they're not necessarily sure this is going to work or be good for me. But I mean, in a more general sense, this isn't necessarily a new problem, right? Yeah. It's something that, yes, I think you touched upon this, that in the more recent years, this is something that has affected everyone, where you had to make a decision, whether that's something you want to go along with or not. But I mean, vaccines have been around in some form or another for quite some time. This isn't the first time there's even been controversy talking about vaccines being employed upon a population, typically, around younger people, infants and children. We all have immunizations, right? You probably have more than me because of your time in the service, but nonetheless, it's pretty easy to say that I think that generally speaking now we can say that using vaccines and immunizations in general has been a productive thing to eradicate some pretty terrible diseases, and that's obviously a positive. However, there are some stark examples where that wasn't true. I mean, not that it didn't ultimately end up positive, but there's always repercussions, right?
But we should also look into like other things that might have led to the sickness, humans going away. So, not living on $2 a day, having more food, better healthcare in general. How much of these diseases were mitigated from vaccines or just from lifting billions of people out of poverty?
The quality, the change in quality of life. Yeah.
Right. So that's the other side of the debate as well that we hope to talk about.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, can we attribute all of the quote unquote success of vaccine programs to that actual vaccine? I think the other part too is we're not specifically out here to bash on vaccines. Like we said, we want to look at both sides of the story, but just to give people kind of a background check that maybe they haven't been aware of these other examples. Ones that I'm specifically referencing earlier, in time back in the 50s is right where we started having people look into developing vaccines for various diseases. Even before that, actually, But one of the very prominent examples that affected even our parents' generation, I think that's why it kind of interests me. I remember my father and uncles and other people of that generation talking about this, is the development of, say, the polio vaccine.
Yeah.
That'll be something that we'll take a deeper dive into, but obviously polio isn't an extraordinarily common occurrence, especially in the more modern world, first world countries. I actually don't know numbers off the top of my head for elsewhere, but I'd speculate there are probably parts of the world where that still is an issue, where maybe immunizations and access to healthcare is a little bit lagging. And so, generally speaking, when you read about the polio vaccine and its development, it's touted as a success story. And I think that's fair to say. However, what I think is often forgot or kind of skated over perhaps is the fact that there was some growing pains in that process, just like what we're seeing now in the modern era with our COVID technology, the COVID vaccine mRNA technology and other vaccine technology, where we're seeing people have unfortunate side effects. That's not new, right? So this is in a way kind of part of the game of doing the science and trying something new, where you might have benefits, sure, and you have to kind of weigh that cost benefit ratio. But yeah, in even the 50s, when this polio vaccine was first developed, there was a distribution that led to a number of children actually becoming infected with polio rather than preventing, and that resulted in paralysis and sickness, in some circumstances even death. And so there are reasons for that we'll get into later, but again, this isn't a new thing. I think the other big one that we'll probably touch upon too, kind of the third leg in this vaccine tripod, kind of the short series that we'll go over, is the debate over whether there actually is a correlation or causation effect with vaccines and autism. And I think that's something that it's definitely more recent than the polio vaccine and that controversy, but kind of in between that and now. Right. In fact, it's still ongoing, that debate, interestingly enough, despite there being a lot of science that kind of has more or less tried to debunk that correlation. It's still not necessarily, at least in mainstream culture, a definitive thing. Is that fair to say? Is that your perspective?
No, I was actually researching this the other day, and you would think that you'd just be able to find a study that compares the relevance of children with autism who got vaccinated versus those who didn't. Mm. And it's really not, for some reason, it's not a study that pops out super quick.
Right.
It could be that I didn't find it. However, I was able to find a couple studies that showed a positive correlation between the different vaccines and autism. However, it's important to, I learned this the hard way, to look to see where those studies are published, who published them and where, and doing a little bit of background research into some of the first authors, or the authors in general, found that he had a couple of his papers redacted. Yeah. Unfortunately, you don't, at least I couldn't find why, but that is a red flag in publishing papers. If you have a paper that's redacted, it's pretty much shunned.
Yeah,
for almost the rest.
It's
of your
not
life.
Looked well in terms of your reputation. There is probably a legitimate reason why. No, I think that's a really good point too. Is that just because something gets published in academia or outside of academia, for that matter, isn't to say that is 100%
gospel.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's been plenty of times, and I mean, this happens every day. There's a pretty extensive review process when you're publishing, but it might not it might surprise people how lax it kind of is, or how
they don't replicate the studies like.
Yeah, it's basically people proofreading
Yeah.
your paper and saying, does it make sense from like a conceptual standpoint? Are there really blatant, exaggerations or conclusions that you might not be able to take away from that? Errors, but it's become quite common for I think people to see papers get redacted.
Yeah. I think the most famous ones now are with the Alzheimer's. That
yeah, that's another.
Pretty clear that faked some data, altered some images, and I think he just resigned as president of Stanford.
Right, that's within the last couple weeks where but we've been aware of this potential for quite some time, and I mean the implications of that.
It's billions of dollars of taxpayer,
decades,
yeah.
And potentially lives when you think about it.
Easily lives. Yeah. Where would we be with Alzheimer's research if we didn't have the beta amyloid hypothesis?
Right.
For the past 20 years.
So I mean, when you look at scientific literature, it is a great and wonderful thing, but like you said, it's not gospel. It's kind of not 100% verifiable until you have multiple people able to reproduce it.
Yeah.
And in a lot of these kinds of controversial type discussions, that's one of the big issues, is being able to replicate it over and over again and really provide that really big backbone to a theory or a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think you alluded to this too, that it's not actually as easy as someone might expect to find information out. And while we have more access to trustworthy information,
not just like a news post, or you need kind of like to know how things work, and if you can't just read like an abstract. Sometimes there's hidden details in, most people probably don't even know the supporting
information, sometimes like 50 pages, and that's where
if they're honest enough to add it.
Sure. And the hard truth, and I'm not going to say that this is something I think is always malicious, but the hard truth is that when you're publishing, you're trying to put together a compelling story.
Right.
And for every one experiment that gets published and noted in the primary paper, there's probably 100 experiments that don't. And those could be one. Yeah, at least one. And those could be all failures.
Yeah.
Like I remember in my first publication, we worked on that work for 3.5 years, and the amount of times that it failed before I got it to be reproducible is crazy. And you don't hear about the failures in the published version because no one really cares about the failure, which is kind of not true.
You don't publish experiments that don't work.
Right. And it's almost like a bias into itself, right?
Which you should probably publish experiments that don't work, at least for like the bare minimum of other people not trying to do that.
Yeah, and right now though, there's not a great mechanism for that.
Yeah.
Truth be told, your papers would be like hundreds of pages long, but that's something that I always kind of got upset about, or just like had questions about, like why don't we?
It's an opportunity to start a journal that just publishes things that didn't work.
Right. There actually is one that I recall talking to my former advisor about, and it wasn't a well-esteemed journal. It was like called the Journal of Negative Results, where people would actually publish in that. But like for our purposes, it would have been meaningless. It didn't give you any credibility. But it's not a common practice, and I do think that does limit our ability to make faster developments and increases of knowledge. But it's tough to find verifiable, consistent information. I mean, especially in these controversial topics, if you go on Google, which is what most people are going to do,
ChatGPT.
Yeah, your options are pretty much like the same as everyone else's. Even as a quote unquote scientist, you're going to get conflicting information a lot of the time.
Yeah. But I think as like scientists, at least going through the data a ton, you kind of get a pretty or at least somewhat decent bullshit meter of where like this is probably
true.
I better at least find 3 other things that support this.
Yeah, if you're
Before I
reading it
believe
from
it.
like a newspaper article and it's very clear that it's like a right wing or a left wing kind of political leaning, unfortunately politics has played a huge role in what projects get funded even, or how we portray different scientific debates and controversies. It's kind of infiltrated, not in a good way, and that's reflected in the media representation of that for kind of the common people, because most folks that aren't scientists, they don't go read the hard academic literature.
Right, it's difficult. It took me like a year or 2 just to be able to read one paper without like having a headache.
It's dense stuff too. I mean, like, I hate to say it, but in those papers you're using language that your typical person, I mean, you'd have to have a thesaurus or a dictionary to look up some of that
A lot
language.
of dictionary, yeah. A lot of what is the meaning of this word.
Right. I remember showing my dad my first couple publications and he was just like, "That's great, son, but I have no idea what you're talking about. Your words are too big, Yeah. But I mean, that's kind of why we have this, movement to have articles that are more easily, accessible or more easy to understand for people. But they're basically synopsis and summaries that are not very objective at all. They can be misrepresented. They can be skewed in a manner that is maybe not as true to the actual science that was done.
Yeah. Because regardless, you're going to have a bias, and at very bare minimum, you want your experiment to work.
Right.
Right, and that's like the bare bottom bias that almost every scientist has. I was told that that you got a good experiment when something works, but it's not what you expected.
That's true, yeah.
Some sort of result, so it kind of gets rid of your own bias in it. So like maybe you're trying to make a certain molecule, but I forget the word, but
inadvertently or something?
Quite inadvertently, you make a molecule and it's clearly there. It's not an impurity, but it's not the molecule you make.
Right.
So something did happen, but it wasn't the outcome you might have expected.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that is, what you expected to happen or not, it's still science. It's still valid. Some of the most important technological advancements or scientific understandings that we have come from experiments that were essentially accidents. That'd be kind of a fun topic.
Antibiotics.
Antibiotics is like the number one that comes to mind. But yeah, so I mean, I think this is at the beginning of a pretty interesting journey, because I'm excited to do some deep dives on these various topics that we've alluded to. Like I said, I think we'll start kind of on the topic and discussion of maybe background, a little bit of history pertaining to vaccines, and go into the different.
You want to start first with like polio, and then the autism debate or other neurological, and then the COVID, kind of go from history to
now. I think it'd be probably best to go in that kind of chronological order and build up to it. I think those first 2 examples are really just 2 really important examples, because they illustrate, again, the kind of polio. It was a success story, but it's not without consequence. It's not without failure in its own way. Whereas the autism one, I think that is...
It's murky. It's muddy.
It's super
it's not
murky.
Clear cut.
Yeah, and it's a really good example of kind of the modern scientific dilemma that we have, that is not just isolated to that one topic.
At bare minimum, it's not clear if the vaccines are not causing the uptick in autism. I think that it's clear to almost everybody that opens their eyes that 1 in 33 kids now have autism or some type of neurological disorder.
Sure.
Some things, and it's not just more awareness.
Right.
Something's, whether it's the food we eat, the chemicals in the water.
Because you'll hear that all the time. Well, we're just better at diagnosing. We're better at recognizing autism, and partially that might be true, but we're talking
severe autism that it's not low on the spectrum.
Right. So, but you put a good point out there, is that it's pretty hard to isolate it down to just one factor. But I mean, that's kind of why we're going to go into that, is because people tried, and people are still kind of trying to do that. And it's a good example of, I think, scientific intent, but not necessarily good science that leads people in interesting
What's
direction.
the outcome? It's like with any scientific experiment, especially on a biological system. I mean, there's so much that we don't know about our body that you're not going to be able to predict the outcome 100% in 100% of the cases. So,
Yeah. So, well, I don't know if you have anything further to add at this time. This is going to be one of our, I think, shorter introductory episodes. I hope that, we didn't come across as complete lunatics already.
And if you have any ideas of certain things that you want us to discuss,
absolutely
comment it or let us know in some sort of way, and we can kind of do like a little deep dive on it.
Yeah, we're always looking for new topics. We have a short list currently. It'll keep us busy for quite some time, but it's kind of interesting to hear other people's perspectives on what they think is interesting. So reach out to us, let us know. We'll find an avenue for y'all to do that. In the meantime, I guess trust the science.
Trust but verify.
Trust but verify the science. Well, I'm Dr. D.
I'm Dr. B.
And thanks for joining us in our inaugural session. We'll talk to you later.